Forced to marry a stranger, but what he said, when giving her the shoes, changed everything. They say peace is something you can't buy. Well, maybe that's true, unless someone's bold enough to wrap it up in exactly 12 half-starved horses and a 19-year-old girl in a patchwork wedding dress. In New Mexico, they call that an honor bargain. She called it selling off your own flesh and blood with a smile in front of the whole town. Clara Whitmore, the youngest daughter of Whitmore Ranch, used to ride like the wind across open prairie and could tell every horse in the barn by the sound of its hooves. But all of that turned to ash in a single night. The barn went up like a forge, the stench of burning hair mixing with rotted wood until everyone's throat burned. Strangely, the flames stopped right at the east fence, almost as if someone had led them there. By morning, Clara's parents were accused of being deep in debt, and she overheard the whispers, "That family's done for." The only one in the clan still standing tall through the smoke and accusations was her uncle, a man who knew when to smile and how to keep a dirty hand buried in his vest pocket. He volunteered to fix Clara's problem with a peace exchange to the Apache up north. His voice carried just the right shade of pity when he said, "This is a chance for our family to keep a little dignity. They need a bride. We need quiet. Everyone wins." No one said it outright, but everyone knew the string of horses for that trade didn't belong to him. They'd come from another ranch and disappeared barely a week after the Whitmore barn fire. Ironically, the thief was praised as a keeper of the peace. On the day she left, Clara wore the same white dress her mother once wore, a dress now frayed at the hem and patched like an old, inaccurate map. The fabric itched against her skin, and her pride felt as torn as the lace at her wrists. Her uncle hoisted her onto a gray horse, leaning in with one last reminder. "Don't embarrass me. I mean the family." The escort rode for 2 days, crossing dry, wind-swept trails where the air carried dust and the scent of old bones. From the last ridge, Clara saw the Apache camp stretched out in the valley. Cone-shaped lodges, thin smoke rising from cook fires, dogs barking between bursts of children's laughter. It should have been peaceful, but to her it looked like a door slamming shut, locking every way home. Her uncle handed off the reins with a few awkward, half-formal words to the Apache men waiting. One of them, a tall man with black hair tied back, stepped forward. His eyes swept over Clara, not lingering, not rushing, the way a man sizes up a newly arrived piece of trade. Not quite contempt, but not warmth either. That was all. Then she was led down narrow dirt paths, past stacks of firewood, to a lodge slightly larger than the rest. A hide flap hung over the entrance, shifting in the breeze. Her guide pulled it aside and gestured for her to enter. Clara stepped through and was swallowed by the dark. Only the flicker of a small fire lit the space, bringing with it the bitter scent of smoke. Inside, the floor was covered in animal hides, but there was no bed, just a few thick blankets. Clara stood still, heart pounding, listening as the hide flap fell shut behind her with a sound so soft it was somehow colder than a slam. No more footsteps, no uncle's voice, only the dense black air and her own breathing. At 19, Clara had learned to hide her tears from others, but here, in a strange lodge, in a worn-out wedding dress with trail dust still clinging to her boots, she felt herself crushed into pieces, pieces that could be traded away for peace or for whatever else they needed. Clara sat down on the pile of animal hides, her back stiff as a fence post twisted by the wind, eyes fixed on the empty space ahead where nothing moved except the faint glow spilling from the fire pit. Outside, voices murmured in a language she didn't understand, fading farther and farther away until silence swallowed them whole. It was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat, fast and dry, like a horse pushed too far across the desert. She thought, any moment now, he'll come in. The Apache warrior they've shoved me into like a knife into a sheath. And then it would be, Well, exactly what the whole town had gossiped about when they heard the Whitmore girls being married off to an Indian. Not that she believed every bit of the horror stories, but tonight, in this lodge, there was no one to stand up and say otherwise. The hide flap stirred. A figure stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered enough to block half the firelight. He didn't rush, didn't make a sound except the faint whisper of leather rubbing against leather. Black hair pulled back at the nape, a red leather band across his brow. His gaze landed on her, not slow like a threat, not devouring like hunger, just direct. And that, if she were honest, made her heart skip, because she couldn't tell whether it meant safety or danger. No greeting, no signal. He simply came closer. Clara instinctively drew her feet in, bracing herself. Here it is. Now's the part where the town will say, "We told you so." But instead of touching her shoulder or grabbing her hand, he lowered himself, farther than she expected. One knee to the ground, a broad, calloused hand settling over the leather at her boot. Clara froze. Wait, what is this? The question barely had time to form before his fingers began working the stiff, dust-hardened laces loose, knot by stubborn knot. She heard the faint snap as each one gave way, like the sigh of a horse being unsaddled after a long ride. When the boot slid off, the chill air slid in after it, carrying with it a relief so sharp it almost felt uncomfortable. From beside him, he picked up a wooden basin, dipped a cloth into water warmed by the fire. Droplets fell onto her bare foot like stray rain in the wrong season. He wiped away the red trail dust caked into her skin. Slow, steady strokes, sure and unhurried. No glance upward, no searching eyes, no demand in the touch. Just the quiet rhythm of a man doing something as if it were the most ordinary act in the world. No one had ever done this for her before. At home, she handled her own needs, and anyone who helped always added a reminder, a look, or a debt to be paid later. But here, in a stranger's lodge, a man she'd met less than 10 minutes ago was bowing his head, carefully washing her travel-worn feet as if it were a ritual he alone understood. She wanted to ask why, but the question caught in her throat. Maybe because she was afraid the answer might shatter the fragile thing wrapping around her now, a mixture of suspicion and something dangerously close to safety. When he was done, he set the cloth aside, stood and stepped to the fire to add more wood. His broad back cast a wavering shadow against the hide walls. He didn't speak. He didn't turn. But Clara realized something strange. The wall she had built around herself during the long ride, the one as solid as desert rock, now held a thin crack, and through it a strange warmth seeped in, just enough so she didn't feel entirely alone in the long night ahead. A few days later, Clara began to notice something different. Not that Takoda suddenly spoke more. Lord help her, he could probably go a week without saying a word and be just fine. But little things had begun appearing quietly outside her lodge each morning. The first time, it was a strip of soft leather dyed a warm reddish brown, still carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. She bent to pick it up, glanced around. No one there. No note. No message. Just the thing itself, sitting there as if it had fallen from the hand of some ghost who knew how to care. The next day, it was a piece of cornbread, still warm as if it had just been lifted from hot stones. Clara looked at it the way you'd look at a coiled snake, because back home, free food usually came with a price. She ate it, of course, but she stayed wary, knowing a hungry stomach was the easiest thing to buy. On the third day, it was a piece of supple hide, soft enough to make a small pouch or patch a corner of a blanket. When she touched it, the texture brought back the memory of someone's hand, his hand, washing the dust from her feet that first night. And with that, her mind started to fill with questions, none of which found an answer. Takoda was unchanged. He came and went when he pleased, without explanation. Occasionally, when their eyes met, he'd give a small nod, as if they'd already said all there was to say, though in truth they'd barely said anything at all. One evening he came in holding something small, pale bone gleaming faintly in the firelight. Sitting down, he opened his hand, a bone bracelet, carved with simple patterns, worn yellow with time. "It was my sister's," he said, his voice low, as if speaking too loud might break something in the air between them. "She's gone." Clara waited, but he said nothing more. He didn't tell her who she was, how she died, or why he was giving the bracelet to a near stranger. He simply placed it in her hand, then stood as if it were nothing important. To an outsider, it might have looked like a beautiful gesture, but to Clara, it felt like being handed a sealed envelope with no letter inside. She wore the bracelet, not because she understood its meaning, but because, truthfully, she wanted to know what it was hiding. The Apache villagers never said what they thought, but their eyes told her enough. They were watching. Each time she went to the stream for water or past the cook fires, there were eyes following her. Not cold, but not exactly warm either, like they were waiting to see what she would do with the things left outside her lodge each day. And that was when the biggest question began to gnaw at her. Why had Takoda agreed to this marriage? It wasn't her looks. She didn't believe she had much left of those after days of dust and heat. It wasn't wealth. Her family had nothing left but a fire and a heap of rumors. So then, what in God's name was it? Clara didn't know when she might learn the truth, or if she even wanted to. But that night, when her fingers brushed the bone bracelet, she realized something. Even without explanations, those small, wordless signs were slipping in, breaking down the wall she'd built around herself. And God help her, the dangerous part was she was starting to let them. That morning, the sky was clear, but the air bit like a stranger's handshake. Clara was sitting at the threshold of the lodge, absently turning the bone bracelet around her wrist, when the shadow of a tall woman fell across her. She wore a soft, earth-toned buckskin dress, her silver hair tied low, and her dark eyes carried the weight of someone who knew more than she intended to say. "I'm Nima," she said, her voice not exactly soft, but not hard either. "Today, you sit in the circle with the women." Clara blinked. Circle? Sit with them? She glanced toward the cluster of lodges to the east, where several Apache women were gathered, hands busy spinning thread, grinding corn, or mending clothes. In her mind, sit with sounded suspiciously like be questioned in front of a crowd. "Thank you," she replied, her tone flat enough to be a refusal. Nima didn't press. She only gave Clara a look that seemed to say, "You'll come anyway," and turned away. Clara exhaled, thinking she'd dodged it, but by midday, as she crossed the packed earth square to fetch water, she saw a little girl, no more than 6, trip over a pile of firewood and fall face first. Before the child could cry, 3 or 4 hands were already there, lifting her up, brushing dirt from her hair, fixing her crooked braid. No scolding. No, "Were you careful?" Only gentle laughter, like spring wind passing through dry grass. For some reason, that sight slowed Clara's steps. Something in her chest, that part trained to shrink in the company of others, unwound just a fraction, and without thinking too hard, she changed direction and walked straight toward the women's circle. They didn't stop what they were doing when she arrived. Nima simply gave a small nod and pushed a bundle of flax fibers and a wooden spindle toward her. "Twist it," she said. Clara took them and sat down on a hide mat beside an old woman sewing a pouch. At first, her fingers were clumsy, breaking more strands than she joined, but no one laughed. No one sighed. Every so often, a sun-browned hand would reach over and adjust the way she rolled the fibers to keep them even. Slowly, the work drew her into its rhythm, steady, unhurried, without pressure. She sat there, listening to the pound of the pestle, the crackle of the fire, the soft hum of a mother singing her baby to sleep. The Apache words drifting around her were strange, but not unpleasant, like the sound of a distant stream, warm even without meaning. After a while, someone passed her a small bowl with a piece of golden cornbread. Clara took it, nodding her thanks. No one asked where she was from. No one mentioned the trade. Here, she wasn't an item to be bartered, nor a stranger to be guarded. When the sun tipped westward, the circle began to break apart. A young woman set a fresh bundle of fibers in Clara's lap, saying simply, "Continue tomorrow." Not an invitation, not an order, just something that would happen. Clara carried the bundle back to her lodge, realizing that for the past few hours she hadn't thought of her uncle, the burned barn, or why Takoda had taken her. Only of the smell of smoke, the sound of laughter, and a feeling she hadn't had in a long time, that she could sit among others and not feel lost. That afternoon, Clara sat again in the circle, twisting fibers in her hands, trying not to think about the way Takoda's eyes had looked when he passed by earlier that morning. Everything was as it always was, the pound of the pestle on corn, the chatter of children in the corner of the yard, the smell of stew tangled with wood smoke. Until Taya, the young woman with long hair and an all-knowing gaze, settled down beside her. Taya handed Clara a strip of soft hide to pad her fingers, then leaned in, whispering as though the wind itself might overhear. "He's paying an old debt." Clara's head came up, but Taya had already dropped her eyes to the fibers in her lap, as if she hadn't said anything worth noting. "A debt?" Clara asked, forcing her voice to stay even. Taya only shrugged, the corner of her mouth curling. Not quite a smile, not quite a smirk. "Apache don't forget, especially debts that aren't paid in silver or horses." And then she rose, walking toward the cookfire, leaving Clara with the words hanging in the air, like smoke that refused to clear. All afternoon Clara tried to pick at the knot of that sentence, but the harder she pulled, the tighter it seemed to draw. What debt? To whom? And why had Taya said it as if it had everything to do with Clara, not some far-off ghost from the past? That evening, when Takoda stepped into the lodge, Clara studied him as though he were a painting she'd seen before, searching for what had changed. He set down an armful of wood, poured water, added a few sticks to the fire. Nothing unusual, except that he never once looked her in the eye. In her mind, theories sprouted like weeds. Was she just a stand-in for someone else? Another woman, white like her, who had once walked through here, sat by this same fire. Or was she Takoda's way of making amends for something he had done, or failed to do? When her fingers brushed the bone bracelet on her wrist, the questions sank in deeper. "My sister," he'd said, but what if the story wasn't that simple? What if the bracelet wasn't just a keepsake, but a reminder of that debt? Takoda's silence was like a mountain range, not empty, but dense, its weight casting a shadow over her sleep. That night, the wind hissed through the seams of the lodge, sounding like someone dragging a long, endless secret around the village. Clara lay with her face to the wall, eyes open, replaying Taya's words. Part of her wanted to believe Takoda kept her here for something good, protection, perhaps. But the other part, the part that remembered her uncle's smile as he set her on the horse, suspected she was nothing more than a pawn on a game board she hadn't yet seen in full. News of the meeting drifted through the village like cook-fire smoke on the wind, not loud, not hurried, but slipping into every lodge and every glance. Clara knew this wasn't going to be a tea and gossip kind of gathering like in town. This was when the people whose voices mattered decided what was worth keeping, and who was worth letting stay. Takoda didn't tell her to come. He didn't tell her to stay home either. He simply handed her a soft buckskin cloak and left ahead of her, leaving her with the choice. Maybe it was courtesy, or maybe it was his way of saying, if you dare, you'll walk there yourself. Clara thought about staying in the lodge, pretending not to know, but Taya's shrug, her words, an old debt, and the quiet offerings left at her door over the past weeks kept circling in Clara's mind. If she stayed silent now, wasn't that the same as accepting she was just a trade item? When she arrived, the circle of older men was already seated around the fire in the center of the square. The sun and wind had carved lines deep into their faces, their eyes set deep, as if they could see the history of the whole land. Outside the ring, women and children stood watching, not crowding, but attentive. Every gaze turned to Clara. It felt exactly like standing in the middle of town, hearing men discuss her price as if she were a young horse, except this time there were no smirks, no knowing winks. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her voice at first trembled like an old thread, but with each word she forced herself to meet their eyes. I was brought here as part of a trade. I don't deny that. But since I stepped into the women's circle, I haven't felt like a trade item. I've worked, I've learned, I've eaten and sat with them. I know I wasn't born here, didn't grow up here, but if you'll allow it, I want to stay, not as payment for a debt, but as part of this fire. The air stilled, flat as a pond's surface. Sika stared at her so long that Clara began to wonder if she'd said something wrong in English. Then he gave a small nod and spoke a single word in Apache, round and solid as a well-shaped stone. Dahrika. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, soft as wind over prairie grass. Clara turned to Taya, who leaned close and whispered, "Belongs to the fire." The feeling that washed over her was part relief and part something close to fear, because this recognition was real, and it also meant she'd just bound herself to something she didn't yet understand. Takoda stood at the edge of the circle, watching her with unreadable eyes. Not pride, not disapproval, just silence, as if he'd known the outcome all along. The fact that he didn't nod or clap her shoulder made her wonder even more. If he hadn't wanted her here, why hadn't he stopped her from the start? The meeting ended, the people dispersed. Clara remained standing there, the warmth of the fire at her back and the chill of the open space ahead tugging at her in opposite directions. She had been accepted, called one of the fire. But the thing she wanted to know most, the real reason Takoda had taken her, still lay somewhere behind the wall of his silence. And this fire, though it had just given her a place, could just as easily swallow her whole if she dared step too close to that secret. News usually reached the Apache village in one of two ways: on the weary hooves of a messenger, or from the mouths of wandering traders, the kind who sold salt and stories in equal measure. This time, it came by way of the latter. That afternoon, as the sun slid down behind the mountain ridge, like a ripe orange slipping from a hand, a trader appeared at the village gate. His coat was dusted over, the smells of horse and tobacco clinging to him. He handed Takoda a small pouch of silver, then lingered, as though there was something more valuable than silver to deliver. "Word from New Mexico," he said, his voice carrying a touch of caution. "About the girl, Clara." Takoda didn't move, but his eyes sharpened like the edge of a blade. "Speak." The trader glanced around. This wasn't the kind of talk meant for a third set of ears, then leaned in, speaking low. "That Whitmore barn fire wasn't an accident. It was her uncle. That night, I saw two of his hired men carry lanterns inside, lock the doors from the outside. By morning, that land was in his hands, and the debt was gone like smoke. You know why?" Takoda said nothing, but his face darkened like the sky before a storm. "Because the girl was the only one who knew he'd been running stolen horses for you," the trader went on, dropping his voice even lower. "If she burned with the horses, no one could charge anyone with anything. But the fire never reached her room. He panicked, so he gave her to you in that peace deal. Killed 2 birds, kept the peace, erased a witness." Takoda didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the mountains, where the light of evening was painting the treetops red, before he finally asked, "Who else knows this?" "Not many, but the uncle still thinks you're an old ally." The trader left, and Takoda stood unmoving for a long while. All those days of silence, all those slow gestures, all the times he'd let Clara choose for herself. They all traced back to this. He hadn't taken her out of pity, nor out of some quiet wish for a wife. He'd taken her to keep her out of reach of her uncle, the man who'd burned a barn full of horses just to bury a secret. The bitter truth was this. If Clara knew, she'd see that Takoda had once been a link in that same chain of smuggling. He wasn't innocent, but he had cut that chain before it could tighten around his own neck, and before it could tighten around hers. Night fell, the fire in the lodge throwing Takoda's shadow against the hide walls. Clara sat in the corner, still turning the bone bracelet around her wrist, unaware. She looked at him the way someone looks at a solid wall, never guessing whether its foundation was built from stone or from the ashes of old wrongs. He wanted to tell her, many times, but each time he looked into her eyes, he thought, if she knew she was just a protected witness and not someone I chose, would she still stay? And so, like every time before, Takoda swallowed the words, letting the secret smolder in his chest like embers, waiting for the gust that would set it aflame. 3 days after the trader left, Takoda returned from a long hunt. That morning, dew still clung to the grass, and the wind carried the scent of young pine and cookfire smoke. Clara was sitting at the edge of the lodge, mending a piece of hide, when she saw him walking into the village. His pace unhurried, as if every step weighed a decision. In his hands was a bundle wrapped neatly in deerskin. Without a greeting, without preamble, Takoda set it down in front of her. "For someone who walks beside," he said, his voice firm as a nail driven straight. After a brief pause, he added, "Not behind." Clara unwrapped it. Inside was a pair of new leather shoes, soft and fragrant with herbs, the stitches even and tight. Beads at the toes formed a small sun, catching the light of the early morning. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as though touching something more fragile than glass. She didn't need anyone to explain. This wasn't just a pair of shoes, it was an invitation. A way of saying, from now on, this road will have 2 sets of footprints, side by side. For the first time since arriving in the village, Clara wasn't thinking about the trade, the old debts, or the burned-out barn in New Mexico. Instead, she rose, shoes still in hand, and in full view of the people gathered in the village square, she walked to Takoda. Without hesitation, she reached out and took his hand. It wasn't the tentative touch of strangers, nor the awkward contact of people unused to closeness. This was a deliberate clasp, as if she had signed her name to an invisible document they both understood. Some in the village smiled, others simply glanced and went back to their work. But Takoda stood still, not pulling away. His gaze met hers, and this time, there was no wall between them. That afternoon, Takoda led Clara to the edge of the village, where a square wooden frame had already been raised. He didn't say what it was, but the solid crossbeams told her enough. A house, not for him, not for her, but for both. They stood there for a while, the wind carrying the scents of dry grass and pine resin, the distant sound of children playing, drifting toward them. Clara thought of all she still didn't know. Takoda's secret, the old debt, the true reason he'd taken her. But she also thought of all she did know. The look in his eyes when he gave her the shoes, the clasp of hands in the village square, and the feeling of no longer standing alone against the wind. When the sun dipped low, its golden light wrapped the bare frame like an unfinished promise. Clara slipped the new shoes onto her feet. They fit perfectly, soft enough that she felt she could walk farther than any road she'd ever known. Takoda stood beside her, silent, but as they turned back toward the village, his hand found hers, and this time it was she who gripped first. No one in the village knew where they would go or what the finished house would become, but for Clara, that no longer mattered the way it once had, because sometimes all it takes is a new pair of shoes and a hand that doesn't let go, to believe that no matter how long or short the road ahead, it will be walked together. If that last story touched something inside you, then let the next one take you even deeper, to an ending you won't forget anytime soon. Click the video on the screen